Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey that will take us back beyond the familiar stories, beyond the popular interpretations, beyond everything you thought you knew about humanity's first civilization. We're going to examine what the Sumerian clay tablets actually reveal about the world that existed before the Anunnaki narrative dominated popular imagination. Before Zechariah, Sitchin told us what to believe. Before the History Channel convinced millions that ancient aliens built our civilization. Before the internet was flooded with claims about gold mining extraterrestrials and genetic experiments. The story we're about to explore isn't the one you've heard 1,000 times. It's more ancient, more authentic, and ultimately more fascinating than anything modern theorists have imagined. Because buried in wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago lies evidence of a civilization that rose, flourished, and established the very foundations of urban life long before the Anunnaki even appear in the mythological record as a distinct group. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely value this kind of deep, evidence-based exploration. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always incredible to connect with people across continents, all of us drawn to the same ancient mysteries, asking the same fundamental questions. Where did we really come from? What did the first civilizations actually know? And why have their stories been so dramatically misinterpreted? Dim your lights, get comfortable, maybe pour yourself something warm to drink, and let's dive into the oldest written records of human civilization together. Tonight, we're reading the clay tablets in their own voice, without the filter of ancient astronaut theories, without the distortions of modern agendas. We're going to discover what actually came before. Let's begin not with mythology, but with dirt, with the actual physical evidence that archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered from beneath the desert sands of southern Iraq over the past century and a half. Because before we can understand what the Sumerians wrote about their origins, we need to understand who they actually were and when they actually lived. The name Sumerian doesn't appear in modern scholarship until the mid-19th century, when archaeologists and linguists began deciphering the mysterious wedge-shaped writing found on thousands of clay tablets excavated from ancient mounds scattered across Mesopotamia. These scholars discovered that beneath the Akkadian and Babylonian civilizations they already knew about, beneath the Assyrian Empire that biblical texts had made familiar, lay an even older culture. A people who spoke a language unrelated to any known linguistic family. A civilization that had invented writing itself. The archaeological site of Eridu, located in what is now southern Iraq near the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf, provides our first crucial piece of evidence. Excavations conducted by Iraqi and international teams revealed something extraordinary. Continuous occupation stretching back to approximately 5400 BCE. That's over 7,000 years ago. More than 7 millennia of human settlement at a single location, with the earliest levels showing the transition from small villages to something unprecedented in human history, an actual city. The earliest Eridu, known to archaeologists as Eridu I in the Ubaid period stratigraphy, consisted of small reed structures built on the marshy plains where the Euphrates River met the Persian Gulf. These weren't impressive buildings. They were humble homes constructed from bundled reeds and mud, housing families who fished the rich waters, hunted waterfowl in the marshes, and cultivated small gardens using the natural fertility of the riverbanks. But here's what makes Eridu absolutely extraordinary. Even in these earliest levels, archaeologists found evidence of a temple, a special structure, larger than the surrounding homes, oriented in a specific direction, containing distinctive architectural features that would be repeated and elaborated in every subsequent level of occupation for the next 3,000 years. This wasn't a palace for a powerful chief. It wasn't a storehouse for community goods. It was a religious building, a sacred space dedicated to worship. By Eridu VI, around 5000 BCE, this temple had grown dramatically. It now measured over 12 meters long, constructed on a raised platform that lifted it above the surrounding settlement. Its walls were decorated with elaborate niches and buttresses, creating a rhythmic pattern that would become characteristic of Mesopotamian sacred architecture for millennia. Inside, excavators found evidence of ritual meals, animal sacrifices, and offerings presented to a deity who was already being worshipped with sophisticated ceremonial protocols. This is civilization before writing, before kings, before empires, before anything we typically associate with Mesopotamian culture. And yet already, these people were building monumental architecture, organizing communal labor for religious purposes, developing complex ritual practices, and establishing the institutional foundations that would support everything that came after. The god worshipped at Eridu from these earliest times was Enki, whom we'll discuss extensively tonight. But the crucial point for understanding what came before the Anunnaki narrative is this. Eridu and its temple cult predate by many centuries the emergence of the Anunnaki as a distinct group in Sumerian religious texts. The civilization we're about to explore was already ancient, already sophisticated, already deeply rooted in its landscape and traditions when the mythological narratives we know from later tablets were being composed. Uruk, located about 50 miles northwest of Eridu, provides our second crucial archaeological window into pre-Anunnaki civilization. The site occupies over 6 square kilometers and contains occupational deposits reaching depths of 18 meters in some locations, representing continuous habitation from approximately 5000 BCE through the Parthian period in the early centuries of the Common Era. The truly revolutionary developments at Uruk occurred during what archaeologists call the Uruk period, spanning roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE. This is when something unprecedented in human history happened, something that would change our species forever. During these centuries, Uruk transformed from a large village into humanity's first true city, with a population that may have reached 50,000 people or more. 50,000 humans living in close proximity, depending on complex social organization, specialized labor, long-distance trade, and institutional administration. The archaeological evidence from late Uruk period levels is staggering. The Ina district, sacred to the goddess Inanna, contains monumental buildings constructed on platforms, decorated with elaborate cone mosaics creating colorful geometric patterns, oriented according to astronomical alignments. These structures required thousands of workers, sophisticated planning, mathematical knowledge, organizational hierarchies, and mobilization of resources on a scale never before attempted. And here's the detail that changes everything. It's from late Uruk period contexts, from levels dating to approximately 3400-3200 BCE, that we find humanity's first writing. Not fully developed literary texts, not religious hymns or mythological narratives, but proto-cuneiform tablets containing pictographic symbols representing objects and numbers, administrative documents tracking economic transactions. These earliest tablets record deliveries of grain, inventories of livestock, distributions of goods to workers. Their accounting records, bureaucratic paperwork generated by temple institutions managing agricultural estates and craft workshops. Writing was invented not to tell stories or preserve sacred knowledge, but to keep track of sheep and barley and beer rations. Think about what this means. The civilization that invented writing, that created the technology allowing human knowledge to be preserved across generations, that developed the tool making everything else possible: literature, history, law codes, scientific texts. This civilization existed and was already sophisticated before it could record its own myths about the Anunnaki or any other gods. The people who built Eridu's temples, who transformed Uruk into the world's first city, who invented writing itself, were not working under Anunnaki supervision. They were not following extraterrestrial instructions. They were humans, solving human problems, creating human solutions to the challenges of organizing increasingly complex societies in a challenging environment. By the time Sumerian scribes were pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets to record mythological narratives about gods descending from heaven, about divine councils making decisions, about the Anunnaki as a distinct group of deities, their civilization was already over 1,500 years old. The temples had been functioning for millennia. The cities had been thriving for centuries. The agricultural systems, craft technologies, trade networks, and social hierarchies were all firmly established. The Anunnaki appear in texts that were composed after this entire civilizational development had already occurred. They appear in religious literature that was written down long after the society that produced that literature had achieved its fundamental character. This chronological reality, this archaeological fact, completely undermines any claim that the Anunnaki founded Sumerian civilization or were present at its origins. Now let's push even further back, beyond even early Eridu, to explore the cultural foundation upon which Sumerian civilization would eventually be built. Because the story doesn't begin with the Sumerians. It begins with an earlier people whom archaeologists call the Ubaid culture, named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid, where their characteristic pottery was first identified. The Ubaid period, spanning roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, depending on regional variations, represents the crucial developmental phase when southern Mesopotamia was first permanently settled by farming communities. Before the Ubaid, the southern alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were largely uninhabited marshlands, challenging environments that offered rich resources but required sophisticated adaptive strategies to exploit successfully. The Ubaid people developed these strategies. They learned to construct reed houses on the marshy islands, using the abundant plant resources of the marshlands themselves as building materials. They domesticated the water buffalo, adapting their animal husbandry practices to the wet environment. They pioneered irrigation agriculture, digging the first small canals to channel river water to fields, beginning the process that would eventually transform Mesopotamia into the most productive agricultural region in the ancient world. Ubaid pottery is immediately recognizable to archaeologists. It's characterized by a distinctive buff or greenish clay body, decorated with dark painted designs, geometric patterns, stylized birds, running animals, occasionally human figures. This pottery appears across an enormous geographic range, from the Persian Gulf coast north to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, from western Iran to Syria, suggesting extensive trade networks or shared cultural identity across hundreds of miles. But here's what's most significant for our investigation tonight. Ubaid period sites show clear evidence of social differentiation, public architecture, and religious institutions developing long before any written texts exist to tell us about gods or creation myths or divine hierarchies. At Eridu, the sequence of temples built one atop another throughout the Ubaid period demonstrates continuity of religious practice spanning millennia. At Tel Abada in the Hamran Valley, excavators found an Ubaid period building containing dozens of clay sickles and other agricultural tools stored together, suggesting communal ownership or centralized redistribution, institutional economic management predating cities by centuries. The Ubaid culture wasn't Sumerian in the strict sense. We don't know what language these people spoke, since they left no written records. They may have been the ancestors of the later Sumerians, or they may have been a different population that was later absorbed or replaced. But they established the settlement pattern, the agricultural technology, the architectural traditions, and the religious practices that Sumerian civilization would inherit and elaborate. This is crucial for understanding what came before the Anunnaki narrative. The foundations of Mesopotamian civilization, irrigation agriculture, temple-centered communities, craft specialization, long-distance trade, social hierarchy, all developed during the illiterate Ubaid period. They weren't gifts from gods or aliens. They were human innovations, developed gradually over centuries through experimentation, adaptation, and accumulated cultural knowledge. When Sumerian scribes eventually composed myths about gods creating humanity and teaching them civilization, they were creating theological explanations for developments that had actually occurred through slow cultural evolution. The myths were sacred narratives giving meaning and cosmic significance to historical processes. They weren't eyewitness accounts of actual events. Now we can finally turn to the texts themselves, reading what the earliest Sumerian written records actually say. Because once writing was invented around 3403-200 BCE, there's a long period before we get the mythological texts that mention the Anunnaki or other divine beings. The earliest texts are purely administrative, as we've discussed. But by the early dynastic period, particularly early dynastic III spanning roughly 2600 to 350 BCE, Sumerian scribes were composing religious hymns, dedicatory inscriptions, and eventually full mythological narratives. The administrative texts from Uruk IV and Uruk III levels, dating to approximately 3300-3000 BCE, are humanity's first written documents. These tablets contain pictographic symbols representing objects, heads of cattle, ears of grain, vessels of beer, combined with numerical notations. The script is proto-cuneiform, not yet the fully developed wedge-shaped cuneiform that would emerge over the following centuries. These texts mention no gods. They record no myths. They preserve no creation stories or divine genealogies. They're bureaucratic records documenting the day-to-day economic operations of temple institutions. Hundreds of these tablets have been excavated, and collectively they reveal a society with sophisticated administration, complex economic organization, and institutional structures managing substantial resources. One tablet records 54 units of grain delivered to a temple storehouse. Another lists 7 cattle and 3 sheep received as offerings or tribute. A third documents rations distributed to named individuals, probably workers employed by the temple. These are the actual oldest human writings. This is what literate Sumerians first chose to preserve in permanent form, accounting records. The Farah tablets, excavated from the site of ancient Shuruppak, and dating to approximately 2600-500 BCE in early dynastic Yia, represent a quantum leap in textual sophistication. These tablets, numbering over 1,000 fragments, include not only administrative documents, but also lexical lists, organized compilations of words grouped by category, and the earliest known literary texts. The lexical lists are particularly revealing. Scribes compiled lists of trees, lists of wooden objects, lists of metal items, lists of animals, lists of professions. These weren't random vocabularies. They were pedagogical texts, teaching tools used in scribal schools to train the next generation of literate specialists. They reveal an educational system already sophisticated and institutionalized, training young scribes in the complex cuneiform writing system that required mastering hundreds of signs. Among the Farah tablets are also religious texts, hymns praising various gods, offering formulas used in temple rituals, incantations for protection or healing. The pantheon visible in these early texts includes Enlil, Inanna, Enki, Udu, Nana, the major deities we know from later Sumerian religion. But the Anunnaki as a group are barely mentioned, appearing only occasionally and not in any prominent role. The Zaim hymns, known from later copies but possibly dating to early dynastic composition, are among the earliest Sumerian literary texts. These hymns praising temple buildings and the cities housing them provide our first window into how the Sumerians conceptualized their relationship with the divine. The hymns describe temples as literal dwellings of gods, as points of contact between heaven and earth, as sources of abundance and prosperity for their cities. One hymn to the temple of Kesh begins, "Kesh, it is a temple rising like a mountain, reaching to heaven's heart." The imagery is of connection, of the temple as Axis Mundi, the cosmic center where divine and human realms meet. Another hymn describes Eridu as the place where the pure me were perfected, where the fundamental principles of civilization were established in pristine form. These early religious texts portray gods as deeply connected to their cities, as embodying the prosperity and power of their urban centers. Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk, Enki in Eridu, each deity is inseparable from their geographic location, their temple, their community of worshippers. This is religion rooted in landscape and urban identity, not in extraterrestrial origins or ancient astronaut narratives. The Gudea cylinders, inscribed for Gudea, ruler of Lagash around 2140–4212 for BCE, provide extensive narrative texts describing the construction of a temple. These cylinders contain over 1,400 lines of Sumerian poetry and represent some of the longest literary texts surviving from the 3rd millennium. They describe in elaborate detail how Gudea received instructions from the god Ningirsu in a dream, how he gathered materials from distant lands, how he organized the labor force, and how the completed temple was dedicated with lavish ceremonies. What's significant is how these texts portray divine-human interaction. The god doesn't descend physically to give instructions. He communicates through dreams and signs that must be interpreted. The actual construction work is done entirely by human laborers using human technology. The materials are transported by boats on rivers and canals, by donkey caravans across mountains, through trade agreements with distant cities, all recognizably human activities. There are no spacecraft, no advanced technology, no flying vehicles, no genetic engineering. There's religious devotion, careful planning, international trade, skilled craftsmanship, and community organization. This is how temples were actually built in ancient Mesopotamia, and the contemporary texts describe the process accurately. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia was organized into a system of independent city-states, each centered on a temple complex dedicated to a patron deity. This political and religious structure would characterize Sumerian civilization for centuries and represents the social organization within which the mythological texts about the Anunnaki would eventually be composed and understood. Each major city had its divine patron. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Uruk was sacred to Inanna, goddess of love and warfare. Worshipped Nanna, the moon god. Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, was home to Enlil, the king of the gods. Lagash honored Ningirsu, a warrior deity. Kish in the north was protected by Zababa, another war god. These weren't merely symbolic relationships. The patron deity was understood to literally dwell in the temple, to own the agricultural land surrounding the city, to employ the population as their workforce. The human ruler, whether called Ensi, governor, or Lugal king, depending on period and political circumstances, served as the deity's earthly representative and chief temple administrator. The city-states competed with each other constantly. Boundary disputes were common, as cities argued about control of agricultural land and water resources. Border monuments, often inscribed with curses calling upon the gods to punish any who moved them, marked territorial claims. Military conflicts erupted regularly, with cities forming alliances, waging wars, conquering neighbors, and being conquered in turn. The Stele of the Vultures, commissioned by Enatum of Lagash around 2450 BCE, commemorates his victory over the neighboring city of Umma in a border dispute over the Gaidina, a fertile plain both cities claimed. The monument depicts piles of enemy corpses being devoured by vultures, while the victorious king leads his phalanx of soldiers, and the god Ningirsu captures enemies in a net. The accompanying inscription describes how Umma had violated sacred boundary agreements, and how the gods decreed Lagash's victory. This interstate conflict, this constant jockeying for power and resources among competing city-states, was the political reality of Sumerian civilization. Each city claimed divine sanction for its actions. Each ruler portrayed himself as executing the will of his patron deity. Warfare itself was understood as occurring in both earthly and divine realms simultaneously, with gods fighting in heaven while their human servants fought on earth. The Council of Nippur functioned as something like an interstate religious authority. Nippur itself remained relatively weak politically, but enormously important religiously, because it housed the Ekur, the temple of Enlil, who was recognized by all Sumerian cities as the supreme king of the gods. Control of Nippur, or recognition by Nippur's priesthood, conferred legitimacy on ambitious rulers seeking to dominate other cities. The title King of Kish became a hegemonic claim, suggesting authority over all Sumer. Rulers who conquered Kish and controlled the north would adopt this title to assert supremacy over the southern cities as well. Lugaltsagesi of Umma, who temporarily united Sumer around 2350 BCE, boasted in inscriptions that he controlled territory, from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, establishing a pattern of universal kingship claims that later empire builders would follow. This political landscape, competing city-states, shifting alliances, periodic unifications under powerful rulers, constant warfare justified through divine mandates. This was the context in which Sumerian religious literature was composed. The myths weren't describing ancient history or alien interventions. They were reflecting contemporary political realities, using stories about divine councils and conflicts among gods to make sense of the human conflicts and power struggles that defined Sumerian political life. When we read about assemblies of gods making decisions, we're reading about how Sumerians understood political power and authority, projecting their own city-state councils onto the divine realm. When we read about conflicts between deities, we're reading theological justifications for interstate warfare. When we read about patron gods commanding loyalty, we're reading about how cities understood their corporate identity and divine protection. The Sumerians are credited with an extraordinary number of technological innovations that fundamentally shaped subsequent human civilization. Understanding what they actually invented through human ingenuity helps us appreciate that their achievements don't require extraterrestrial explanation. These were clever solutions to practical problems, developed gradually through experimentation and refinement. The wheel first appears in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, not as a transportation device, but as a potter's wheel, allowing ceramic vessels to be formed with unprecedented speed and symmetry. Wheeled vehicles, carts and wagons pulled by donkeys or oxen, appear in the archaeological and pictographic records slightly later, around 3200 BCE. These early vehicles used solid wooden wheels, heavy and inefficient by later standards, but revolutionary for transporting goods across the flat Mesopotamian plains. The simple wheel might seem obvious to us, but it represents sophisticated conceptual thinking. The principle of rotation around a fixed axle requires understanding mechanical advantage, reducing friction, and translating rotational motion into linear movement. The Sumerians figured this out through human intelligence, not alien instruction. The plow, specifically the cedar plow that could plant seeds while breaking ground, appears in Sumerian contexts around 3000 BCE. This innovation dramatically increased agricultural efficiency, allowing a single farmer with an ox-drawn plow to cultivate far more land than possible with hand tools alone. Sumerian administrative texts carefully track plow teams, demonstrating that institutional managers understood the technology's economic importance. Cylinder seals, invented around 3500 BCE, served as personal signatures and property markers. These small carved stones, when rolled across wet clay, produced distinctive images and patterns that identified ownership, witnessed contracts, and sealed correspondence. The seals became increasingly elaborate, depicting complex mythological scenes, demonstrating artistic sophistication alongside their practical administrative function. Bronze metallurgy, the alloying of copper with tin to produce a harder, more durable metal, was perfected in Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium. This technology required sourcing materials from distant regions, copper from Oman or Anatolia, tin from even farther afield, possibly Afghanistan, demonstrating extensive trade networks. Metalworkers experimented with different ratios, developing specialized alloys for different purposes: tools, weapons, vessels, statues. Mathematics and accounting systems developed to manage the complex temple economies. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal, base 60, numerical system, which we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They developed standardized weights and measures, allowing trade to occur fairly across different cities. They created tables of reciprocals, multiplication tables, and even solved quadratic equations, demonstrating mathematical sophistication arising from practical need. Beer brewing was refined to an art form in Sumer, with multiple varieties documented in texts and several beer recipes preserved, including the famous Hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of brewing, which contains actual instructions for beer production. Beer wasn't merely recreational. It was a staple food, a form of payment to workers, an offering to gods, and a medium of exchange. Temple institutions employed specialized brewers producing enormous quantities. Textile production, particularly wool weaving, was a major industry. Thousands of administrative texts track sheep herds, wool deliveries, textile production in temple workshops, and finished cloth distribution. Different weave patterns, fabric qualities, and garment types were distinguished with precision. Textile workers, predominantly women in specialized workshops, represented a significant portion of temple workforces. Sailing boats capable of navigating the Persian Gulf enabled trade with distant regions. The Sumerians imported timber from Lebanon, precious stones from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, and exotic goods from the Indus Valley civilization. Maritime technology, boat construction, sail design, navigation techniques, developed through centuries of practical experience, enabling the economic connections that sustained urban civilization. These innovations weren't gifts from the gods or aliens. They were human achievements, solutions to specific problems developed by intelligent, creative people facing environmental challenges and opportunities. The archaeological record documents their gradual development, shows experimental failures alongside successes, preserves the incremental improvements over time that characterize authentic technological evolution. When we find the earliest wheels, they're crude. When we find later wheels, they're refined. When we find the earliest bronze objects, the alloy ratios are inconsistent. Later bronzes show mastery. This is what human technological development looks like: gradual improvement through experimentation and knowledge transmission across generations. It doesn't look like sudden appearance of fully developed technology, which is what we'd expect if aliens had provided instructions. Understanding how the Sumerians actually understood their world, their place in the cosmos, and their relationship to the divine requires careful attention to the texts they left behind. And what emerges from this careful reading is a worldview much more sophisticated than the simple, primitive people worshiping alien gods narrative that ancient astronaut theorists promote. The Sumerian concept of me provides crucial insight. These divine principles or cosmic ordinances governed all aspects of existence, from natural phenomena to cultural practices. The me included kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of metalworking, writing, music, and dozens of other fundamental aspects of civilization. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and cleverly obtains the me from Enki while he's drunk, then transports them to her city Uruk. This myth wasn't describing ancient history. It was explaining why Uruk became politically and culturally dominant in early Sumerian history. The me represented cultural knowledge, institutional authority, and civilizational capabilities that could be transferred between cities and deities. The Sumerian understanding of fate and destiny was complex. Destiny, Nam, was understood as decreed by the gods, fixed at certain key moments. The creation of the cosmos, the birth of an individual, the beginning of a year. The divine council, particularly the 7 Anunnaki judges, determined fate. Human actions occurred within this framework of divine determination, yet humans weren't understood as mere puppets. There was space for human agency, for clever action that could work within or around divine decrees. The cosmological structure we discussed earlier, heaven, earth, underworld, with the Abzu as primordial fresh water beneath everything, wasn't merely geographic. It was theological and philosophical, expressing ideas about order and chaos, the created world and the primordial state, the temporal and the eternal. Earth was the ordered realm, structured through divine action and human civilization. The Abzu and underworld were liminal spaces, closer to primordial chaos, dangerous but also sources of power and wisdom. Temple architecture embodied this cosmology. The ziggurat, that characteristic stepped pyramid structure, though built somewhat later than the period we're focusing on tonight, represented the sacred mountain, the connection point between earth and heaven. The temple at its summit was the literal dwelling of the god, the place where divine and human realms met. Ascending the ziggurat was moving from the profane human realm toward the sacred divine realm, a physical journey reflecting a spiritual movement. Ritual practice maintained cosmic order. Daily rituals performed in temples, awakening the god statue, washing and dressing it, presenting food offerings, reciting hymns, weren't merely honoring the deity. They were understood as maintaining the cosmos itself, sustaining the divine presence that kept ordered reality functioning. If these rituals ceased, if temples were abandoned, cosmic order would begin unraveling, chaos would encroach, and disaster would follow. This is why temple institutions were so important in Sumerian society. They weren't merely religious in our modern sense of providing spiritual comfort or moral instruction. They were cosmically essential, literally keeping reality functioning properly through continuous ritual action. This explains why temple estates controlled so much land and employed so many workers. Maintaining the cosmos was serious business, requiring substantial resources. The relationship between humans and gods was fundamentally transactional, but not crudely so. Humans provided service, labor, offerings, worship, ritual maintenance. Gods provided protection, prosperity, order, and meaning. But this wasn't slavery, at least not in Sumerian understanding. It was a reciprocal relationship with obligations on both sides. Gods who failed to protect their cities could be reproached. Rulers who neglected temple duties risked divine disfavor and political failure. When we read Sumerian prayers and hymns, we find sophisticated theological thinking. Gods are praised for their specific attributes and domains. Their characters are complex, not simple. They have preferences, emotions, relationships with each other. They make mistakes, as when Enlil sends the flood and later regrets the decision. They learn, change their minds, negotiate with each other. This is anthropomorphic theology, certainly, gods portrayed with human characteristics, but it's philosophically sophisticated anthropomorphism, using human terms to explore profound questions about power, justice, fate, meaning, and cosmic order. These weren't primitive people creating crude myths. These were intelligent thinkers using mythological narrative to express and explore ideas about reality. Now we arrive at the central question this video set out to address. What actually existed before the Anunnaki narrative became prominent in Sumerian religion? What does the archaeological and textual evidence actually reveal about the origins of Sumerian civilization? The answer is clear. Everything essential to Sumerian civilization existed before the Anunnaki appear as a distinct group in mythological texts. The settlements, the agriculture, the cities, the temples, the writing, the technologies, the social organization, the religious practices, all developed through human agency over millennia before scribes composed the myths that would later be so dramatically misinterpreted. The Ubaid period farmers who first settled the southern marshlands around 6500 BCE, who built the earliest temples at Eridu, who developed irrigation agriculture. They created the foundation without any Anunnaki involvement because the Anunnaki didn't exist yet even as a concept in religious thought. The Uruk period urbanization around 4310 BCE, when villages transformed into cities, when monumental architecture appeared, when writing was invented, when complex economic institutions emerged. This revolutionary transformation of human society occurred without Anunnaki supervision, because the religious texts mentioning the Anunnaki weren't composed until centuries later. The early dynastic city-states around 2900 to 350 BCE, when Sumerian civilization reached its characteristic form, when the pattern of competing urban centers each with its patron deity became established, when the earliest literary texts were composed. Even at this stage, the Anunnaki appear only marginally in religious texts, not as the central creators or organizers of civilization. The timeline is definitive. Archaeological evidence provides absolute dates through radiocarbon analysis, through stratigraphy, through pottery typologies. We can track the development of Mesopotamian civilization step by step, century by century, and we can see that it develops gradually through recognizable processes of cultural evolution, technological innovation, and social complexity emerging from simpler forms. The textual evidence is equally clear. The earliest written texts are administrative, mentioning no gods at all. The early religious texts mention many gods but give no prominence to the Anunnaki as a group. Only in later mythological compositions, particularly those known from Old Babylonian period copies, roughly 2100 BCE, though possibly based on earlier oral traditions, do the Anunnaki appear in the prominent roles that later interpreters would seize upon. And even in these later texts, when we read them carefully in proper translation by qualified scholars, the Anunnaki are not extraterrestrial visitors. They're not genetic engineers. They're not mining gold. They're judges of the dead, determiners of fate, chthonic deities associated with the underworld and with cosmic destiny. Their role is important but specific, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with ancient astronauts. The Sumerian king list, which we discussed extensively in the previous script, claims that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu before the flood, and that 8 kings ruled for impossibly long periods totaling over 240,000 years. Ancient astronaut theorists seize on this as proof of alien intervention, claiming these long-lived kings were extraterrestrial or hybrid beings. But the king list itself reveals its mythological character through these impossible chronologies. These aren't meant to be historical dates in our modern sense. They're expressing the sacred character of antediluvian time, the special nature of that primordial period before the flood reset human history. The gradual reduction in reign lengths as the list proceeds from mythological to historical kings shows the scribes themselves understood they were moving from sacred time to historical time, from myth to memory. Moreover, extremely long antediluvian chronologies appear in other ancient Near Eastern traditions completely independently. The Genesis genealogies give the pre-flood patriarchs lifespans of 900 plus years. The Sumerian king list gives its antediluvian kings reign lengths of tens of thousands of years. Egyptian king lists claim divine dynasties of gods ruled before human pharaohs. This is a widespread mythological pattern, not evidence of actual longevity or alien presence. We must address directly the interpretive framework that has so thoroughly distorted public understanding of these ancient texts. Zecharia Sitchin's ancient astronaut theory, first presented in The 12th Planet, 1976, and elaborated across many subsequent books, has shaped how millions of people understand Sumerian civilization. And virtually every key claim he made is demonstrably false. Sitchin claimed he could read Sumerian cuneiform and was therefore accessing the texts directly rather than relying on scholarly translations. However, actual Sumerologists and Assyriologists, scholars who have devoted their careers to mastering these languages, unanimously agree that Sitchin's translations are riddled with errors, mistranslations, and outright fabrications. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar with expertise in ancient Semitic languages, systematically examined Sitchin's linguistic claims and found them completely unsupported. Heiser points out that Sitchin regularly confuses Sumerian and Akkadian, two completely different languages, mistranslates basic vocabulary, ignores grammatical structures, and invents meanings for words that no legitimate lexicon supports. The word Anunnaki itself, as we've noted, means princely offspring or offspring of it, not those who from heaven to earth came, as Sitchin claimed. This isn't debatable among scholars who actually read Sumerian. Every major Sumerian lexicon defines the term consistently, based on straightforward etymology from Sumerian components and heaven and Unna offspring progeny, and the determinative Kai. Sitchin's translation is linguistically impossible. Sitchin's claim that Sumerian texts describe a planet called Nibiru with a 3,600-year orbit bringing aliens to Earth is similarly without foundation. The Sumerian word Nibiru appears in astronomical texts as a general term for celestial bodies, sometimes referring to Jupiter, sometimes to a crossing point or fairy. It's not a planetary name in the sense Sitchin claimed, and no text describes it as having the characteristics he attributes to it. The astronomical tablet Sitchin repeatedly cited, claiming it showed the solar system including Nibiru, has been examined by actual experts in Mesopotamian astronomy. They identify it as showing known planets and stars in standard Mesopotamian astronomical notation, with nothing resembling Sitchin's interpretation. His reading requires ignoring conventions of Mesopotamian astronomical texts and imposing meanings the symbols simply don't have. Sitchin's claims about Sumerian texts describing genetic engineering of humans by mixing Anunnaki DNA with that of primitive hominids find absolutely no support in any actual text. The creation myths describe humans being fashioned from clay mixed with divine essence, usually blood or spittle, using imagery of pottery or brick-making. This is clearly mythological language about divine creation, not a description of genetic manipulation disguised in ancient terminology. The gold mining operation that supposedly motivated the Anunnaki's presence on Earth appears nowhere in authentic Sumerian texts. Gold is mentioned occasionally, as it is in texts from any culture that valued precious metals, but no text describes gods mining gold or creating humans to mine it for them. This entire narrative is Sitchin's invention, not based on any actual cuneiform inscription. The supposed Anunnaki rebellion described in texts like Atrahasis actually concerns minor gods Ijigi, who complained about the hard labor of digging canals and building infrastructure. The solution was creating humans to take over this work. This is a mythological explanation for why humans do agricultural labor, because gods got tired of doing it themselves. It has nothing to do with mining operations or genetic engineering. Why did Sitchin's theories gain such wide acceptance despite being completely wrong? Several factors contributed. First, the texts he claimed to translate are genuinely inaccessible to most people. Cuneiform tablets in museums require specialized training to read, and even in published scholarly editions, they remain intimidating to lay readers. This created space for someone claiming special knowledge to offer alternative interpretations. Second, Sitchin's narrative is genuinely exciting. Ancient aliens creating humans through genetic engineering, advanced civilizations visiting Earth from another planet, hidden knowledge that mainstream scholars suppress. This is the stuff of compelling science fiction. It's more dramatic than the scholarly consensus of gradual cultural development through human innovation. Third, the late 1970s and 1980s saw explosive growth in popular interest in ancient mysteries, UFOs, and alternative archaeology. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, 1968, had prepared the ground. Sitchin's work appeared at exactly the right cultural moment to capture public imagination, riding a wave of skepticism toward academic authorities and fascination with extraterrestrial life. Fourth, Sitchin presented himself as an outsider challenging the establishment, appealing to anti-authoritarian sentiments. He positioned mainstream scholars as close-minded guardians of orthodoxy, who refused to consider evidence that contradicted their paradigms. This narrative resonates with people who distrust experts or feel alienated from academic institutions. But the reality is that scholars aren't suppressing evidence of ancient astronauts. They're reading the same texts Sitchin claimed to read, but they're reading them correctly, using actual knowledge of Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and context. And what they find is sophisticated mythology, complex theology, and impressive human achievement, but no aliens. So if the Sumerian texts don't describe ancient astronauts or genetic engineering, what do they actually reveal? What can we learn from these oldest written records about how the first civilization understood itself and its world? The texts reveal a people deeply conscious of living at the intersection of nature and culture, of being creatures who transformed wild landscapes into ordered civilization. The contrast between the cultivated field and the uncultivated steppe, between the city and the wilderness, pervades Sumerian literature. Civilization was understood as a hard-won achievement, constantly threatened by chaos, requiring continuous effort to maintain. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian version of the flood story, begins by describing the creation of humans and animals, the founding of cities, and the establishment of kingship. But then humanity multiplies too successfully, becoming too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the gods. This leads to the decision to send the flood. After the deluge, when Ziusudra survives and the gods regret their destructive decision, they decree that humans will henceforth be limited by mortality, infertility for some women, and infant mortality to prevent overpopulation. This myth reflects genuine Mesopotamian anxieties. The cities did face overpopulation relative to agricultural capacity. Disease and infant mortality were tragically common. The flood references real catastrophic flooding events that periodically devastated the region. The myth takes these real experiences and frames them theologically, asking, why do these terrible things happen? What is humanity's proper relationship to divine power? The debate between sheep and grain describes a time before agriculture when humans knew not the eating of bread, knew not the wearing of clothing, ate grass with their mouths like sheep, drank water from ditches. Then the gods created lahar, sheep livestock, and ashnan, grain in the mountains, and brought them down to provide for humans. This myth explains the origins of agriculture and animal domestication as divine gifts, technologies that transformed human life from animal-like subsistence to civilized prosperity. We can read this mythologically, understanding it as sacred narrative giving meaning to cultural developments. Or we can recognize that it preserves memory, however mythologized, of the actual Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and herding that occurred in the Fertile Crescent starting around 10,000 BCE. The Sumerians, inheritors of this agricultural tradition, understood that there was a time before farming, when humans lived very differently. The myth of Enki and Ninmah describes the creation of humans in detail. Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah fashioned the first humans from clay taken from the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean. The text describes a curious episode where Enki and Ninmah have a creation contest, each making humans with various disabilities, challenging the other to find roles for them in society. This strange narrative addresses profound questions about disability, purpose, and social inclusion. What's striking about this myth is its experimental quality. Creation isn't described as a single perfect act producing an ideal result. It's portrayed as a process involving trial and error, experimentation, problem solving. The gods are creative beings who work through challenges, not omnipotent entities who simply decree perfect results. This reflects a worldview that understood creation as ongoing process rather than completed event. The instructions of Shurapak, one of the earliest examples of wisdom literature, contains practical and ethical advice presented as instructions from a father to his son. Do not steal anything, do not kill yourself, do not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your skull. Do not boast in beer halls like a deceitful man. Do not pass judgment when you drink beer. This is practical wisdom about living successfully in Sumerian society, not divine revelation or alien instruction. These instructions reveal a society that valued restraint, honesty, practical intelligence, and social harmony. The advice about beer halls and avoiding judgment while drinking shows that ancient Sumerians faced the same social challenges we face. Alcohol affects judgment. Intoxicated people shouldn't make important decisions. Public boasting is unseemly. These are universal human concerns, addressed through cultural wisdom transmission. We've journeyed through 7,000 years of history tonight. From the earliest Ubaid farmers settling the Mesopotamian marshlands around 6500 BCE, through the revolutionary urbanization of the Uruk period when cities and writing emerged, into the early dynastic city-states when Sumerian civilization reached its classical form, and finally into the texts themselves, reading what they actually say about origins, gods, and humanity's place in the cosmos. And the conclusion is inescapable. Sumerian civilization developed through entirely human processes over millennia before the Anunnaki even appear as a distinct group in the mythological record. The settlements, agriculture, irrigation, cities, temples, writing, technologies, art, literature, laws, institutions, everything that made Sumer what it was, developed gradually through human innovation, intelligence, and effort. The Anunnaki, when they finally appear in texts, are not extraterrestrial visitors or civilization's founders. They're chthonic deities, judges of the dead, determiners of fate, members of the divine pantheon with specific roles that have nothing to do with genetic engineering or gold mining or ancient astronauts. The real story of Sumerian origins is more impressive than the alien intervention narrative. Humans created the first civilization. We invented agriculture, developed cities, created writing, built monumental architecture, organized complex societies, generated sophisticated art and literature, all through our own capabilities, all through accumulated knowledge passed across generations, all through creativity and problem-solving in response to environmental challenges. This doesn't mean the Sumerian texts are worthless or merely primitive myths. They're profound theological and philosophical explorations of existence, meaning, cosmic order, and human purpose. They reflect sophisticated thinking about difficult questions. They preserve early human efforts to understand our place in the universe, to explain where we came from and why we're here. When we read these texts accurately, respecting what they actually say rather than imposing modern theories, we discover a civilization that thought deeply, created magnificently, and laid foundations that subsequent cultures built upon for millennia. We discover our own ancestors, people like us in their intelligence and creativity, facing similar questions about meaning and purpose, expressing their answers through rich mythological narratives. The Sumerians deserve better than having their achievements attributed to alien intervention. They deserve recognition as the remarkable humans they were, the first to create urban civilization, the inventors of writing, the founders of literary traditions, the original city builders. Their legacy lives on in our alphabet, derived from cuneiform, in our hours and minutes, based on their sexagesimal mathematics, in our legal codes and political structures and religious traditions. Before the Anunnaki narrative that later cultures would elaborate and that modern theorists would misinterpret, there was Ubaid farming culture. There was gradual irrigation development. There was the slow emergence of social complexity. There was the revolutionary invention of cities and writing. There were centuries of human innovation, experimentation, and cultural transmission. And that story, the true story told by archaeological evidence and careful textual analysis, is far more inspiring than any ancient astronaut myth, because it's our story. The story of what we achieved, what we created, what we built from nothing but human intelligence working with mud, water, and reeds on the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia 7,000 years ago. The record does not begin with an explanation. It begins as if something is already underway. The earliest clay tablets from Uruk do not introduce themselves, do not pause to clarify purpose, and do not show signs of tentative experimentation. They appear already aligned with a system that expects to be understood. Numbers are impressed with confidence. Signs are repeated consistently. Totals are closed. The tablets assume a reader who knows what is being counted and why. These earliest administrative tablets dating to the late 4th millennium BCE are not narratives. They do not describe origins or justify authority. They record barley allocations, livestock transfers, labor assignments, and temple offerings. The clay is shaped quickly, flattened, and impressed while still wet, suggesting speed and routine rather than ceremony. Many were discarded almost immediately, found in refused layers near administrative buildings. They were tools, not monuments. What is striking is not merely their age, but their completeness. The numerical system used on these tablets already distinguishes between commodities. Different counting systems are applied to grain, animals, and manufactured goods. This is not a single arithmetic method gradually adapting. It is a set of parallel systems operating at once, each suited to a specific administrative need. The logic behind these systems is implicit, not explained, implying prior familiarity among those who used them. The signs themselves show little hesitation. Proto-cuneiform is often described as pictographic, but even at this early stage, many signs are abstracted beyond easy visual reference. Their shapes suggest standardization rather than improvisation. They are placed in orderly rows, aligned with numerical columns, following conventions that are already fixed. Corrections are rare. Erasures are minimal. The tablets do not look like drafts. Excavations at Uruk, particularly in the Ina precinct, have uncovered thousands of such tablets within a relatively narrow time span. There is no clear sequence showing the slow assembly of this system. Instead, the tablets appear in large numbers, already functioning as part of an administrative apparatus tied to temples, storerooms, and labor management. Architecture and record-keeping seem to arrive together, coordinated rather than sequential. The scribes responsible for these tablets remain mostly anonymous. Their names are rarely recorded at this stage, yet their presence is unmistakable. The consistency of hand, spacing, and sign formation across tablets suggests training. Training implies instruction. Instruction implies an established body of knowledge that precedes the tablets themselves. The clay records may be the first surviving trace, but they do not read like the beginning. Even the choice of what to record is revealing. The tablets focus almost exclusively on institutional activity: temples, workshops, herds, fields. There is little evidence of private accounting or personal ownership. The system is designed to serve an organization that already understands itself as enduring. Time is tracked, deliveries are scheduled, obligations are fulfilled. These are not the concerns of a society inventing administration. They are the concerns of one maintaining it. Some tablets include impressions of cylinder seals, marking authorization. The seals themselves depict scenes that assume shared symbolism, figures presenting goods, ritual gestures, hierarchies of scale. The imagery suggests that authority is already visualized and accepted. The seal does not explain power, it certifies it. The tablet becomes valid not because it persuades, but because it conforms. There are no surviving tablets from Uruk that explain why this system exists. There are no instructional texts outlining how to count or why certain units apply to certain goods. The absence is notable. It suggests that such explanations were either unnecessary or located elsewhere, perhaps transmitted orally or preserved in forms that have not survived. The tablets we have are not foundational documents. They are operational ones. This raises a quiet difficulty. If writing emerges here as a response to administrative pressure, the pressure itself must already be present. Large-scale redistribution, labor coordination, and resource storage require prior organization. The tablets record the flow, not the formation, of these systems. They measure movement within a structure whose origins remain unstated. Later Sumerian texts will speak of divine assignment of roles, of offices granted and duties fixed. But in these earliest records, there is no reference to gods or kings. There is only process. Grain moves from field to storehouse. Workers receive rations. Animals are counted, then counted again. The repetition implies continuity beyond any single moment. Archaeologically, there is no clear pre-administrative layer where simpler records gradually evolve into these tablets. The material record is uneven, but the absence remains suggestive. The system appears not as a fragile experiment but as a working memory already relied upon. Writing here is not exploratory. It is corrective, confirming that what was expected has occurred. If the earliest tablets function as confirmations rather than inventions, then their silence becomes meaningful. They do not announce a beginning because they do not perceive themselves as one. They are part of an ongoing order, concerned only with keeping it intact. The clay holds numbers, not origins. And if the first written records do not mark the start of civilization, but rather its routine maintenance, where, in the Sumerian understanding of time, was the beginning actually placed? If the earliest tablets seem unconcerned with beginnings, the next body of evidence is more explicit about where memory chooses to pause. The Sumerian king list does not open with an origin story of humanity or a justification of rule. It opens with a statement of transfer. Kingship, it says, was lowered from heaven. Then it proceeds to name rulers whose reigns stretch across spans of time that do not behave like ordinary chronology. What follows is not confusion, but order, an order that assumes a division already understood. The king list exists in several copies, preserved on clay prisms and tablets from different cities and periods. While the names and reign lengths vary slightly, the structure remains consistent. There is an early sequence of rulers described as reigning before a flood, followed by a clear break. After this break, kingship is said to descend again, and the list resumes with rulers whose reigns shorten dramatically and whose cities are archaeologically recognizable. What is notable is not the length of the early reigns, but the way they are treated administratively. The text does not question them. It does not explain them. It records them with the same formula used for later kings: name, city, length of reign. The difference lies not in format but in placement. The list does not begin with the earliest city known to archaeology. It begins with a category of rulership set apart by circumstance. This separation is not marked as mythic within the document itself. There are no qualifiers to suggest allegory or symbolism. The scribes who copied the list did not add commentary to distance themselves from the early entries. Instead, they maintained the division carefully, even when updating the list to include later dynasties. The pre-flood rulers remain fixed at the beginning, unexpanded and uncorrected, as if anchored to a memory beyond revision. The cities associated with these early kings, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are real places excavated and stratified. Their inclusion is not arbitrary, yet their earliest archaeological layers do not align neatly with the extraordinary reign lengths assigned to them. The king list does not attempt to reconcile this. It preserves both strands without explanation, suggesting that its purpose is not chronological accuracy in the modern sense, but continuity of record. In later periods, the king list served a clear administrative function. It was used to legitimize rule, to establish precedents, and to frame political authority within a recognized sequence. Dynasties inserted themselves into this chain carefully, emphasizing succession rather than innovation. Even rival cities acknowledged the same early sequence, despite competing claims in the present. The authority of the list lay in its inherited structure. The break introduced by the flood is therefore not a narrative flourish but a boundary condition. It marks a disruption after which kingship resumes, not begins. The language used is precise. Kingship is said to be lowered again, not created anew. The implication is that the institution existed before, was interrupted, and then restored. The list is less concerned with how kingship originated than with how it survived discontinuity. There is also a restraint in what the list omits. It does not describe the actions of the pre-flood kings. It does not attribute laws, buildings, or inventions to them. Their role is simply to have reigned. Governance is treated as a state of being rather than a series of achievements. By contrast, later inscriptions often celebrate construction projects or reforms. The early rulers are remembered only as placeholders in a sequence. This selective memory suggests that the list functions as a framework rather than a chronicle. It establishes that rulership precedes catastrophe and persists beyond it. The scribes copying the list seem less interested in the details of early governance than in affirming that there was governance at all. Civilization, in this view, does not originate after the flood. It resumes. The Anunnaki appear in related traditions as figures associated with decree, judgment, and the assignment of destinies. In the king list itself, they are absent. Their role is implied only indirectly through the concept of kingship descending from a higher realm. The text does not position them as founders of human order, but as part of a system in which authority is transferred, withdrawn, and restored according to conditions not fully specified. What emerges is a document that treats the past as layered rather than linear. The earliest layer is not accessible through detail, only through acknowledgement. The flood marks a reset of administration, not of memory. Later kings rule in the shadow of an earlier, largely unarticulated order that nonetheless defines legitimacy. If the king list begins after something else, it may be because that something was not meant to be examined, only recognized. The list records where the present stands in relation to an inherited structure, not where that structure came from. And if rulership itself is remembered as something restored rather than invented, what does that suggest about the cities that claim to have always been there? If rulership is remembered as something resumed rather than begun, the places over which it presided appear to share a similar silence about their own origins. The earliest Sumerian cities do not announce themselves as foundations. They do not preserve inaugural moments in inscription or ritual record. Instead, they present themselves archaeologically as accumulations, layers of occupation pressed one upon another, with no clear threshold where a settlement becomes a city. At Eridu, long considered among the earliest urban centers in southern Mesopotamia, excavation reveals a sequence of superimposed buildings extending deep into the Ubaid period. The lowest levels are not marked by a dramatic architectural shift. There is no sudden appearance of monumentality. Instead, modest structures gradually give way to larger ones, rebuilt repeatedly on the same footprint. Each reconstruction respects the orientation of the previous building, even when materials and scale change. The continuity suggests obligation rather than innovation. The central temple mound at Eridu is particularly instructive. Over time, more than a dozen temple structures were erected atop one another, each carefully aligned with its predecessor. Floors were raised, walls thickened, but the sacred axis remained fixed. Builders did not clear the site to begin anew. They preserved what lay beneath, incorporating earlier remains into later construction. The city's architecture behaves as if it is maintaining a memory rather than creating a statement. There are no inscriptions from Eridu's earliest phases declaring a founding ruler or dedicatory act. Later texts associate the city with primordial significance, but these associations appear retroactive. The material record itself offers no single moment that can be isolated as a beginning. Occupation seems to deepen rather than start, as though the city grew into its status gradually, without needing to mark the transition. Nippur presents a similar pattern. As a major religious and administrative center, It was rebuilt continuously for millennia, yet its earliest levels do not contain a foundation inscription or a narrative of establishment. The Ekkur Temple complex shows successive rebuildings that respect earlier layouts. Even when political power shifted elsewhere, Nippur remained significant. Its authority derived not from dominance but from permanence. It was treated as a place that had always been there. This absence of foundation myths within the material record is notable given the Sumerian habit of recording administrative and ritual detail. When later kings rebuilt temples, they often commemorated the act with inscriptions, naming themselves and invoking divine approval. The lack of such inscriptions in the earliest layers implies not neglect, but a different understanding of legitimacy. There may have been no need to claim authorship over something already regarded as established. Urban planning in these early cities reinforces this impression. Streets evolve organically, following patterns that suggest long-term use rather than imposed design. Residential areas cluster and shift, but do not reset. Infrastructure such as drainage and storage adapts incrementally. There is no evidence of a master plan imposed at a single moment. The city appears to remember its own paths. Even refused layers tell a story of continuity. Waste accumulates in predictable zones over long periods, indicating stable patterns of activity. Craft production areas persist across generations, rebuilt but not relocated. This stability implies inherited knowledge of where things belong and how processes should be organized. The city functions as a repository of practice. Later literary compositions would speak of gods establishing cities, assigning them roles and fixing their destinies. Yet the archaeological record does not reflect a dramatic intervention. Instead, it shows patience. Construction proceeds as maintenance. Expansion respects precedent. The city grows heavier with time, not sharper with intent. This raises a question about how early inhabitants understood their relationship to place. If they did not see themselves as founders, then perhaps they understood themselves as occupants within an ongoing order. The city was not an achievement to be credited, but a condition to be upheld. Its authority lay in duration, not origin. The absence of clear foundation moments also complicates how we interpret later claims of antiquity. When texts describe a city as ancient even in the earliest times, they may not be exaggerating so much as reflecting a lived experience of depth. For a scribe working within a city whose layers extended beyond memory, the distinction between beginning and continuation may have been irrelevant. If cities like Eridu and Nippur were experienced as always already present, then their role in Sumerian thought would be less about creation and more about stewardship. The task of rulers and priests was not to establish the city, but to keep it aligned with what had been received. Urban space became a form of inheritance. And if the earliest cities did not require stories of their own founding to justify their existence, how did the people who lived within them understand the language they used to describe a world that seemed to predate explanation itself? If the knowledge that shaped the earliest cities was carried rather than invented on site, then its most durable vessel would not have been brick or timber, but language. The earliest Sumerian texts do not introduce that language. They assume it. Grammar, vocabulary, and convention appear already aligned, as though the scribes who pressed signs into clay were working within a system whose rules were settled elsewhere earlier, and without written explanation. Sumerian, as it appears in the earliest tablets, is not tentative. It is structurally confident. The language already operates with a full agglutinative system, in which meaning is built through ordered chains of prefixes and suffixes. Nouns carry case endings that distinguish subject, object, location, and direction. Verbs encode agency, aspect, and relationship in ways that are internally consistent across texts. These features do not drift from tablet to tablet. They are applied with regularity. What is absent is evidence of linguistic experimentation. There are no transitional forms showing the gradual assembly of grammatical rules. The earliest inscriptions do not struggle with agreement or syntax. Even when the signs themselves are still pictorial, the underlying language behaves as if it has already been spoken, standardized, and taught. Writing captures it midstream, not at its source. This is especially visible in the use of logograms. Many signs stand not for sounds, but for entire words or concepts. Their meanings are stable across contexts, even when their visual form varies slightly. Such stability implies shared understanding. A logogram only functions if its reader already knows what it represents. The tablet does not define the sign, it relies on memory. Numerical notation reinforces this impression. Although the mathematical implications will be considered elsewhere, the linguistic aspect is already present here. Number words and measurement terms are integrated seamlessly into the language. Different grammatical constructions are used depending on whether one counts people, animals, grain, or land. These distinctions are not explained. They are assumed to be known by both scribe and reader. Bilingual lexical lists from slightly later periods offer further insight. These lists pair Sumerian terms with Akkadian equivalents, suggesting that Sumerian was already perceived as an established language requiring translation. The lists are not primers on how Sumerian works. They are reference tools for those entering an already complex system. Sumerian is treated as a language to be learned, not deciphered. The internal consistency of early Sumerian also extends to its professional registers. Administrative language differs from liturgical language, which in turn differs from legal phrasing. These registers are already differentiated in the earliest surviving texts. Each uses specialized vocabulary and formulae appropriate to its function. Such differentiation suggests long use rather than recent creation. Scribes appear to have been trained within this system, not alongside its formation. Their mistakes, when they occur, are slips of execution rather than misunderstandings of structure. A sign may be omitted, a numeral misaligned, but the grammar itself remains intact. The errors imply familiarity, not confusion. The language also shows no clear external lineage. Sumerian is not demonstrably derived from neighboring Semitic tongues, nor does it clearly influence them at this early stage. It stands linguistically alone, already complete, already bounded. This isolation does not imply sudden appearance, but it does suggest that its formative history lies beyond the horizon of surviving records. Later Sumerian texts will speak of knowledge being preserved through calamity, of wisdom kept safe in temples or entrusted to divine oversight. Yet the language itself preserves no account of its own beginning. There is no myth of first speech, no narrative of invention. Words exist because they are used. Grammar functions because it is remembered. In this sense, language operates as a quiet archive. It carries assumptions about social roles, spatial organization, and authority embedded in its structure. Certain verbs presuppose hierarchy. Certain terms for land and labor imply established institutions. These implications are not argued, they are embedded. The Anunnaki appear in later texts as figures associated with decree and destiny, but the language used to describe them is already mature. The terms for command, judgment, and order are not coined in response to their appearance. They pre-existed. Language does not adjust to accommodate divine authority. It already contains the means to describe it. If Sumerian arrives in writing already complete, then its formation must belong to a period remembered only indirectly, carried forward through speech and practice, rather than inscription. Writing captures the language at a moment when it is already capable of administration, ritual, and law. And if language itself functions as an inherited system, shaped before the first tablets hardened in the sun, then who was responsible for maintaining that system before it was ever written down? And what kind of order required such precision even before records existed? If language could be maintained before it was fixed in clay, then someone must have been responsible for maintaining its use in practice. The earliest administrative tablets suggest that this responsibility was exercised quietly, without invocation of divine authority. Long before kings describe themselves as chosen by gods, and before gods are named as rulers of order, records are already being kept with consistency and expectation. These tablets do not announce who commands them. They list quantities, allocations, and movements as if authority were implicit. Grain is measured and assigned to specific groups. Laborers are counted and categorized by task, age, and status. Animals are recorded by type and condition. The tablets do not justify why these actions occur. They simply register that they do. Many of these records come from contexts associated with temples, yet they do not attribute their directives to deities. The language is administrative rather than devotional. Offerings are counted as commodities, not as acts of worship. Rations are distributed according to standardized rates. The structure of the record implies an office rather than a personality. Power is exercised through procedure. The scribes who produce these tablets are attentive to balance. Totals are checked, columns aligned. When adjustments are made, they are made carefully, often noted with additional impressions rather than erasure. The tablet is treated as an accountable object, subject to review. This implies oversight. Someone expects accuracy, and someone else is answerable for it. What is striking is the absence of narrative framing. There is no appeal to divine will, no invocation of gods as guarantors of fairness or abundance. The records function within a closed system of inputs and outputs. Grain enters storage. Grain leaves storage. Labor is expended. Labor is compensated. The moral dimension, if present, is embedded in the regularity of distribution rather than in explicit decree. In later periods, kings will often describe themselves as shepherds appointed by gods to ensure justice. In these earlier tablets, the shepherd is invisible. The system operates without a named figure at its center. Authority is diffused across offices, roles, and routines. The record itself becomes the instrument of order. Some tablets list groups identified by profession or dependency rather than by individual name. This abstraction suggests an administrative gaze that views society in functional terms. People are not recorded as unique persons, but as bearers of labor obligations or recipients of rations. This does not imply impersonality so much as institutional continuity. The system persists regardless of who occupies a given role. The physical context of these tablets reinforces this impression. They are often found in clusters, stored temporarily, then discarded. They were not meant to endure as monuments. Their value lay in immediate reference. Once their purpose was fulfilled, they could be set aside. Yet their sheer number indicates sustained activity over time. Record-keeping was not occasional. It was routine. The materials themselves are modest. Small clay tablets, quickly formed, quickly impressed. There is no attempt at display. This is not authority performed for an audience. It is authority exercised for function. The absence of decoration or embellishment suggests confidence in the system's legitimacy without the need for symbolic reinforcement. Even terminology reflects this quiet administration. Words for storage, allocation, and delivery recur with precision. They are not poetic, they are technical. Their repeated use implies shared understanding among those who read and wrote them. This shared understanding is not attributed to divine instruction within the text. It exists as professional knowledge. Only later do gods enter the administrative language as explicit overseers. Only later are kings described as intermediaries between divine order and human labor. In these early tablets, the chain of command is shorter and less articulated. Someone assigns, someone records, someone receives. The process is complete without explanation. This raises a subtle implication. If administration precedes divine kingship in the records, then governance may have been understood first as a practical necessity rather than a sacred mandate. The gods, when they appear more prominently, may be formalizing an order already in place rather than creating it. The records do not contradict this. They accommodate it by continuing unchanged. The Anunnaki, when named in later texts, are associated with decrees, destinies, and the regulation of cosmic order. Yet the mechanisms of allocation and accounting already exist before their explicit involvement. The tools of governance are ready. What changes is the attribution of authority, not the practice itself. If someone keeps records before gods are said to rule, then record-keeping itself may be the earliest expression of order, preceding theology and kingship alike. And if that is the case, when divine figures finally enter the administrative imagination, are they assuming control of an existing system, or are they being written into it after the fact? If authority could be exercised through records before it was attributed to divine rule, then the appearance of divine figures in later texts alters the language of governance without necessarily altering its mechanisms. When the Anunnaki enter the written record with greater clarity, they do not arrive as architects of a new order. They are introduced into a system already operating, already measured, already administered. In hymns, liturgical compositions, and mythological narratives preserved on tablets from the early second millennium, the Anunnaki are consistently associated with functions of oversight. They assemble, they deliberate, they assign destinies. Their actions are procedural rather than inventive. The texts describe them convening councils, issuing judgments, and fixing roles. They do not describe them discovering agriculture, devising writing, or establishing cities from nothing. Those elements are treated as existing conditions. The language used to describe the Anunnaki is notably administrative. Verbs associated with them often overlap with those used in bureaucratic contexts: to decree, to allocate, to confirm. Even when their actions take place in a cosmic setting, the structure resembles a formal assembly rather than a moment of creation. Decisions are made, recorded, and enforced. The universe, as depicted, is governed rather than imagined. This portrayal is consistent across multiple textual genres. In liturgical texts, the Anunnaki are invoked as guarantors of order, ensuring that rituals are performed correctly and that boundaries are respected. In mythological narratives, they appear as judges who resolve disputes or assign responsibilities. Their authority lies in regulation. They preside over systems rather than originate them. The absence of invention narratives is striking. When tools, crafts, or institutions are mentioned, they are often said to have been given or assigned, not created anew. The implication is that these things exist in a prior state, awaiting formal allocation. The Anunnaki function as administrators of an inherited order, not as its authors. Even the concept of destiny, so often associated with these figures, reflects this orientation. Destiny is not portrayed as spontaneous or arbitrary. It is fixed, measured, and recorded. Tablets speak of destinies being written or decreed, language that mirrors administrative practice. The cosmos itself is treated as an archive, governed by rules that must be maintained. In some texts, the Anunnaki are described as residing in specific locations, often associated with temples or sacred precincts. These spaces function less as workshops of creation and more as seats of authority. Decisions made there affect the distribution of power and responsibility among gods and humans alike. The setting reinforces the impression of governance rather than genesis. Human kings, when they appear alongside the Anunnaki in later inscriptions, are often described as receiving confirmation of their rule. They are not taught how to govern, they are authorized to do so. The language suggests continuity. Kingship exists as an institution that requires validation, not invention. The divine role is to recognize and regulate what already functions. This relationship mirrors earlier administrative practice, where authority was embedded in procedure rather than personality. The Anunnaki do not disrupt this model. They elevate it, extending administrative logic into the divine realm. The same concepts of accountability, allocation, and oversight apply, now framed cosmically. Notably, the Anunnaki are rarely individualized in detail. Their identities blur into collective function. They act as a group, often unnamed, emphasizing role over character. This depersonalization aligns with bureaucratic structures, where offices matter more than office holders. The divine assembly resembles an institution rather than a pantheon of distinct creators. The texts that describe the Anunnaki were copied and recopied by scribes who were themselves trained in administrative environments. Their choice of language reflects their worldview. They understood order as something maintained through record, decree, and continuity. When they wrote of gods, they used the same conceptual tools they used to describe human governance. This does not diminish the religious significance of the Anunnaki within Sumerian thought. It situates that significance within a framework of preservation. The gods ensure that the world continues as it should. They intervene when balance is threatened, not to create anew, but to restore alignment. If the Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as regulators rather than creators, then their role within Sumerian records reinforces a broader pattern. Civilization is treated as something inherited, periodically disrupted, and carefully restored. Divine authority enters the record not at the moment of origin, but at the moment of formalization. And if even the gods are depicted as administrators of a pre-existing order, then where, within Sumerian memory, was that order first established, and by whom was it first kept? If even the gods are remembered as caretakers of an order already in place, then moments of collapse become critical points of inquiry. The archaeological record preserves such moments not in language, but in soil. At sites like Shurapak and Kish, thick flood deposits interrupt long sequences of habitation, marking episodes when water overwhelmed settlement, erased surfaces, and sealed entire phases beneath layers of silt. At Shurapak, the flood layer is unmistakable. Excavators identified a dense stratum of river-borne clay cutting cleanly across earlier occupational levels. Below it, houses, streets, and refuse attest to a functioning urban community. Above it, construction resumes. What is striking is not the presence of the flood, but what follows it. The layers above do not show prolonged abandonment or tentative reoccupation. Building resumes with purpose. The rebuilt structures do not wander far from their predecessors. Walls align closely with earlier foundations. Streets reappear along familiar routes. Domestic and administrative spaces are re-established without significant deviation in scale or orientation. This suggests that the builders knew where things had been and intended to place them there again. The flood disrupts material continuity, but not spatial memory. At Kish, a similar pattern emerges. The flood layer there, once thought to represent a single catastrophic event, divides occupational phases with remarkable clarity. Yet above the deposit, pottery styles, architectural techniques, and administrative practices resume with only modest variation. The city does not reinvent itself. It reconstitutes itself. This raises a logistical question embedded in the archaeology. Floodwaters remove not only buildings, but also visible markers of organization. Canals silt up, fields are obscured, boundaries dissolve, yet post-flood layers suggest rapid restoration of agricultural management, labor coordination, and storage systems. Such restoration would require knowledge not easily reconstructed from ruins alone. Administrative tablets found above flood layers reinforce this impression. They do not read as the records of a society relearning how to manage resources. Measurements are consistent with earlier standards. Accounting formats persist. Terminology remains stable. The scribes resume their work as if the interruption were an inconvenience rather than a rupture. The flood, in this sense, functions less as an end than as a pause. It erases surfaces but not systems. Whatever knowledge governed land division, ration distribution, and labor obligation survives the destruction. It must have been carried by people rather than structures, preserved in memory and practice rather than inscribed plans. Sumerian texts later speak of a great flood that divides time into before and after. Yet even in these narratives, the emphasis is on survival and transmission. Knowledge is saved, instructions are preserved, and order resumes. The archaeological record, while silent on story, echoes this structure. After the water recedes, complexity returns without delay. This continuity challenges assumptions about how fragile early civilization might have been. If urban life depended entirely on visible infrastructure, a flood of this scale should have necessitated prolonged reorganization. Instead, the evidence suggests resilience rooted in shared understanding. People knew how to rebuild because they remembered what to rebuild. The materials recovered from post-flood levels do not suggest improvisation. Brick sizes remain standardized. Construction techniques follow established patterns. Even the placement of public and administrative buildings adheres to prior conventions. This implies coordination across groups, not individual initiative. The city acts as a collective that recalls its form. In this context, the flood layers do not mark a new beginning but a test of continuity. They reveal what was essential enough to survive disruption. The answer appears to be not monuments or inscriptions, but systems of organization embedded in people. Administration, measurement, and spatial planning persist even when physical evidence is temporarily erased. Later kings will sometimes describe themselves as restorers of temples damaged by flood or neglect. Restoration, not invention, becomes a virtue. The flood does not grant license to redesign. It demands fidelity to what came before. This attitude aligns with the archaeological pattern, where rebuilding honors previous layouts rather than replacing them. The Anunnaki in later texts are associated with judgment after disorder, with the reestablishment of balance. The flood fits within this conceptual framework. It is a disruption that necessitates regulation, not a blank slate inviting creation. Order returns because it is expected to return. If complex systems can reappear so quickly after physical erasure, then their foundation must lie deeper than architecture. It must reside in transmitted knowledge, shared norms, and remembered procedures. The flood layers expose not the fragility of early civilization, but its reliance on memory as infrastructure. And if civilization could be restored after water covered the land and erased its marks, what earlier disruptions might it have already endured before the first layers we can see? And how far back does that remembered order truly extend? If order could be restored after physical erasure, then the rules governing that order must have been carried with similar resilience. The earliest legal texts do not present themselves as experiments. They appear already arranged, already articulated, as though the principles they record had been applied long before they were inscribed. When reform inscriptions and law collections emerge in the late 3rd millennium, they do so with a tone of adjustment rather than invention. The reforms of Urukagina, preserved in fragments from Lagash, speak of correcting abuses, restoring fairness, and returning conditions to an earlier standard. The language does not suggest the creation of new law. It implies a known baseline that had been disturbed and now required repair. These texts assume familiarity with legal expectations. Penalties are stated without explanation. Procedures are referenced without elaboration. The scribes do not pause to define what constitutes theft, injury, or obligation. They record outcomes and stipulations, not deliberations. Law appears as a framework already understood by those who enforce and receive it. The Code of Ur-Nammu, among the earliest surviving law collections, reinforces this impression. Its clauses are concise and confident. If a certain act occurs, a specific response follows. There is no preamble explaining the rationale behind justice, no discussion of precedent. The code reads as a formalization of existing practice rather than a proposal for new behavior. What is absent from the record is any trace of a trial phase. There are no drafts, no provisional versions, no debates preserved in writing. The law emerges fully articulated, structured into clauses that address property, injury, and social status. This structure suggests long use. It is difficult to imagine such precision arising without prior application. Even the language of these codes reflects administrative continuity. Terms for compensation, responsibility, and authority mirror those found in economic and labor texts. Law does not introduce new vocabulary so much as it applies familiar terms to disputes. The same system that measures grain and labor now measures injury and restitution. Later codes, such as that of Lipitishter, follow similar patterns. They acknowledge the role of divine sanction, but the content remains procedural. The gods are invoked as guarantors of justice, not as its designers. The law itself operates within human society, addressing practical concerns of ownership, marriage, and service. The format of these inscriptions also deserves attention. They are carved or impressed as completed works, meant for display or reference. There is no indication that they were revised publicly or updated incrementally. Their authority rests in their presentation as settled statements. This suggests that their legitimacy derives from alignment with established norms rather than from novelty. Archaeological context supports this reading. Legal tablets are often found alongside administrative archives, not in isolation. They belong to the same institutional environment as ration lists and contracts. Law is part of administration, not a separate intellectual pursuit. It regulates relationships already in motion. Contracts and court records from the same periods further imply that legal reasoning predates formal codes. Disputes are resolved according to recognized standards. Witnesses are called. Oaths are taken. Outcomes are recorded. These practices do not reference newly issued laws. They operate as if law is already embedded in social expectation. The absence of legal experimentation is telling. Societies often leave traces of uncertainty when norms are new. Here, the record suggests confidence. The law speaks with the voice of memory, not discovery. It corrects deviations rather than charting unknown ground. This pattern aligns with the broader Sumerian tendency to frame authority as restoration. Kings present themselves as upholders of justice, not as its originators. Their legitimacy lies in maintaining balance, not redefining it. The law, like the city and the language, is treated as something inherited. The Anunnaki, when associated with justice in later texts, are described as confirming destinies and decrees. They oversee law rather than compose it. Their role reinforces the perception of law as part of an enduring order that requires supervision, not invention. If structured legal systems appear without visible drafts, then their formative stages must lie beyond the surviving record. Law, like administration, seems to have been practiced before it was written, preserved through custom and expectation until it was finally fixed in clay. And if justice was already understood well enough to be codified without rehearsal, what other forms of knowledge were similarly maintained, measured, and trusted long before they were ever set down in writing, perhaps even in the movements of the heavens themselves? If law could be written without rehearsal, then the same confidence appears when the sky enters the record. The earliest celestial texts do not read as observations made in wonder. They read as references consulted in routine. Stars are named, paths are divided, and cycles are noted with an assurance that suggests prior familiarity rather than recent discovery. Some of the earliest star lists, preserved on tablets that later scholars grouped under traditions such as the MUL series, present the heavens as an ordered register. Constellations are arranged along defined paths. Their risings and settings are associated with seasons and agricultural phases. The tablets do not explain how these associations were determined. They simply record them, as if the relationships were already established. The language of these texts is technical rather than descriptive. Stars are assigned to domains, gods, and intervals. The sky is partitioned into regular segments that mirror administrative divisions on Earth. This is not the language of tentative watching. It is the language of cataloging. The heavens are treated as a space already mapped. What is notable is the absence of uncertainty. The tablets do not record failed predictions or competing models. There is no visible debate about which star marks which season. Instead, the information is presented as settled. Even when variations occur between copies, the structure remains intact. The system tolerates adjustment without questioning its foundation. In omen texts that draw upon celestial phenomena, such as eclipses or unusual appearances, the emphasis is not on the event itself, but on its interpretation. The sky is read as a text whose grammar is known. An eclipse does not prompt inquiry into celestial mechanics. It prompts consultation of precedent. Meaning is derived from correspondence, not investigation. This approach suggests that the primary function of astronomy was regulatory. Celestial knowledge supported calendars, ritual timing, and agricultural planning. The stars ensured that festivals occurred when they should, that fields were sown and harvested within proper bounds. Accuracy mattered, but explanation did not. The system worked because it was remembered. Even the recording of lunar cycles reflects this orientation. Months are named and ordered. Intercalations are applied to maintain alignment with seasons. These adjustments are administrative decisions, not theoretical ones. The goal is continuity, not precision for its own sake. The sky is managed to preserve order on Earth. The scribes who copied these texts treated celestial knowledge as authoritative. Tablets were recopied across centuries with minimal alteration. The act of copying itself became a form of preservation. Errors were corrected to match established versions, not to update understanding. The past governed the present. There is also a spatial aspect to this memory. Certain stars are associated with specific cities or temples. Their appearances are tied to local ritual calendars. This localization suggests that celestial knowledge was integrated into civic identity. The sky did not belong to individuals. It belonged to institutions. The Anunnaki appear in some celestial contexts as overseers of cosmic order, yet they are not depicted as charting the stars. Their role is to maintain balance between heaven and earth. The stars already have their places. The gods ensure that those places remain meaningful. Once again, regulation replaces creation. Archaeologically, there is no clear evidence of observatories built as experimental spaces in this early period. There are temples, platforms, and courtyards aligned with cardinal directions, but these alignments are consistent rather than exploratory. Builders orient structures according to known principles. The sky guides construction because its order is trusted. Later developments in Mesopotamian astronomy will introduce greater precision and prediction. Yet even these advances build upon inherited frameworks. The earliest tablets establish the categories within which later calculation operates. They define what matters in the sky, not how it works. This suggests that celestial knowledge, like law and language, entered the written record already formed. Its origins lie in sustained practice rather than sudden insight. Generations must have watched, remembered, and transmitted patterns long before scribes impressed them into clay. Writing fixes the memory but does not generate it. If the sky is written as something already known, then the act of observation is less about discovery than confirmation. The stars rise as expected. Seasons follow their courses. Order persists. The heavens reassure by repeating themselves. And if celestial patterns were trusted enough to regulate time, ritual, and labor without explanation, then what other systems depended on equally inherited structures, perhaps not above the earth, but embedded within its measures and numbers? If the heavens could be recorded as memory rather than discovery, then so too could the measures of earth be standardized with the same confidence. Sumerian mathematics in its earliest form does not appear as an abstract pursuit. It appears as a practical language, constructed to manage fields, labor, and time with precision. Numbers are tools, not subjects of inquiry. The sexagesimal system, which divides quantities into units of 60, is present from the earliest tablets. Units of area, volume, and weight are carefully delineated. The tablets record rations, allocations of grain, and distributions of labor with consistent calculations. Fractions are used not for theoretical elegance, but to ensure equitable division. Every measure serves administration. Excavated tables from Uruk reveal standardized counts for grain distribution among workers. Scribes calculate portions down to fractions of sela, the basic unit of measure, with a confidence that suggests long-standing practice. The consistency of these calculations across tablets indicates that knowledge of the system was widely shared, embedded in the routine of governance rather than isolated among scholars. Land division presents another application. Surveying tablets show areas measured and subdivided, boundaries delineated according to unit systems that account for irrigation and crop rotation. Geometry here is not speculative. Angles, lengths, and plots are treated as administrative data, recorded so that future scribes and overseers can reconstruct allocations without ambiguity. Even the representation of time reflects this orientation. The sexagesimal system underpins calendars, months, and hours, linking temporal management with agricultural and ritual cycles. The intercalation of days and the alignment of festivals depend upon precise counting rather than observation alone. Time becomes a measure to coordinate society, not a concept for philosophical contemplation. What is striking is the lack of commentary or theoretical discussion. The tablets do not explore why 60 was chosen, or how calculations might extend beyond immediate need. Mathematical operations are procedural. They are performed because they must be performed to maintain order. Scribes copy problems and solutions as manuals, not treatises. Administrative mathematics also extends into record-keeping of resources beyond food. Livestock, metals, and manufactured goods are accounted for with the same system. Tabulation ensures continuity across years and offices. The preservation of these records implies trust in the procedures rather than reliance on the insight of any single individual. Knowledge is collective. The sexagesimal system also accommodates hierarchical structures. Fractions allow for equitable distribution between multiple classes or groups. Accounting can distinguish between households, laborers, and officials. The calculations themselves reflect an awareness of social structure, encoding inequality and obligation into numbers rather than narrative. In this sense, mathematics functions as memory made tangible. A tablet of calculations preserves not only quantities, but the relationships and responsibilities they imply. The knowledge is inherited. Future administrators can read the numbers and act accordingly, maintaining the city, the storehouses, and the workforce with continuity. Even when the Anunnaki are invoked in numerical contexts, such as in omens or calendrical assignments, they are regulators of order rather than authors of calculation. They confirm alignment and ensure proper measurement. The system predates explicit divine attribution, demonstrating that numbers existed to manage human and material resources long before they were associated with cosmic authority. The persistence of these practices across centuries indicates a conservative approach to measurement. Innovations occur slowly and only in response to administrative need. The emphasis is on preservation and accuracy, not exploration. Tablets are recopying manuals, not laboratories. The sexagesimal system endures because it is functional, not because it is elegant. Sumerian mathematics, therefore, represents an inheritance of procedural knowledge. Calculation is a means of sustaining order, a practical instrument to regulate life in the city and the fields. Knowledge is transmitted through tablets, scribal training, and repeated practice, forming a continuity that requires no novel insight for each generation. If numbers can structure labor, land, and time so consistently without theoretical inquiry, Then the logic underlying administration itself becomes more visible than the abstract principles. Civilizational memory is encoded in arithmetic as much as in clay, and the same precision that counts grain and measures fields may extend to broader domains, yet to be understood. And if mathematics functions first as a tool of governance rather than curiosity, then what other systems, economic, astronomical, ritual, may have been preserved and transmitted in the same way, their principles already operational long before they were fully written down? If numbers could structure the world and ensure continuity, then the same principle applies to the body. Early medical tablets from Sumerian archives do not approach healing as experimentation or theoretical inquiry. They are practical records, instructions for diagnosis and treatment that assume prior understanding, as though the art of medicine had already been practiced long before it was ever written down. The texts themselves are deceptively straightforward. Injuries, symptoms, and illnesses are listed alongside prescribed remedies. Ingredients for poultices, decoctions, or inhalations are recorded with specific measures, often referencing units already familiar from administrative and economic texts. The language is procedural. Do this, apply that, observe the outcome. There is no commentary on why a certain herb works, no speculative discussion of causality. The remedies exist as part of an established practice. Some tablets also address more complex conditions, including fevers, digestive complaints, and infections. Treatments are methodical, layered with instructions that reflect diagnostic reasoning. Certain symptoms are cross-referenced with specific agents, and particular combinations are applied repeatedly. Scribes do not offer new experimentation. They catalog knowledge accumulated and applied over generations. Even the most arcane texts, sometimes written in obscure dialects or specialized signs, suggest that training was expected. Only someone already familiar with the basics of measurement, preparation, and administration could follow the prescriptions correctly. The tablets functioned as manuals for practitioners, not as teaching tools for absolute beginners. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and repetition, then fixed into clay for reference. Archaeological context reinforces this understanding. Many of these medical tablets were found in temple archives or administrative complexes, suggesting a close connection between health, ritual, and governance. Priests or temple officials may have served as both custodians of medical knowledge and coordinators of its practical application. Medicine was a regulated practice, carefully recorded, and integrated into broader social management. The organization of the tablets also implies a standardized approach. Remedies for similar symptoms follow familiar patterns. Ingredients are measured using the same units applied in rationing and construction. This consistency implies institutional control and a shared expectation of procedure. Healing is treated as a procedural act within the framework of civilization, rather than as spontaneous insight. Some texts even incorporate prognostic indicators, noting which conditions were considered more dangerous or which patients were likely to recover. These observations are systematic, again reflecting memory and accumulated experience rather than real-time experimentation. The patient is part of a continuum of recorded outcomes, not a subject of trial and error. The presence of symbolic and incantatory elements alongside practical treatments also warrants attention. Certain procedures invoke divine oversight, often referencing the Anunnaki or other deities. Yet these references appear as formal acknowledgement of authority rather than sources of empirical knowledge. The focus remains on restoring balance within the human body, with divine sanction reinforcing the reliability of established practice. In this sense, Sumerian medicine mirrors administration, law, and mathematics. It is inherited, codified, and preserved. Knowledge is treated as collective memory, sustained through careful recording and transmission. Tablets are not laboratories. They are repositories of applied understanding, meant to maintain continuity across time and generations. The repetitive and standardized nature of these prescriptions suggests a society deeply invested in continuity. Each tablet is an act of preservation, ensuring that procedures can be replicated accurately and consistently. The practice of medicine is less about discovery than about sustaining what is known, protecting lives by reinforcing collective memory and institutional experience. If treatments are written assuming prior knowledge, then the medical tradition must have existed long before the tablets themselves. The clay preserves not the origin of the practice, but the operational framework necessary to maintain it. Every instruction, measurement, and combination of ingredients reflects expertise transmitted over decades or centuries. And if the care of the human body could be systematized and transmitted without apparent origin, then what other aspects of daily life, ritual, architecture, or governance may have relied on equally long-standing frameworks, already perfected in practice before they were ever committed to writing? If medicine could be codified and transmitted as inherited practice, then the spaces in which it, ritual, and civic life occurred might follow the same principle. At Eridu and other early Sumerian sites, the archaeological record reveals temples built repeatedly atop earlier floors, preserving the orientation, footprint, and even dimensions of prior structures. Each generation reconstructs what already existed, maintaining continuity in sacred space rather than seeking architectural novelty. Excavations at Eridu display this stratification most clearly. Successive layers of mud brick foundations rise like sediment in time, each temple slightly larger or slightly more refined, yet rarely departing from the original plan. Walls are thickened, staircases improved, and courtyards expanded, but the axis and primary chambers remain remarkably consistent. The pattern suggests an adherence to inherited design, as if the very plan carried authority and meaning, independent of the current builders. The repeated rebuilding appears less a matter of style than of preservation. Earlier floors were not discarded in memory but in material. New bricks were laid atop old foundations, sometimes incorporating fragments of the previous structure. In some cases, tablets, votive objects, and foundation deposits from earlier temples were embedded within newer construction, reinforcing continuity. The sacred site itself becomes a record, a layered archive of devotion, authority, and memory. Architectural alignment also reflects inherited knowledge. Temples are oriented according to cardinal directions, celestial observations, or geomantic considerations that predate the current construction. Builders did not experiment with orientation. They repeated established axes, respecting measurements and proportions codified in prior generations. The act of rebuilding is as much a ritual of restoration as it is a practical exercise in construction. The ceremonial spaces within these temples show similar continuity. Sanctuaries, offering areas, and processional ways are maintained with minimal alteration. Even when stylistic changes occur in decoration or masonry technique, the spatial logic remains intact. Ritual practice is inseparable from the inherited architecture. The layout dictates movement, offerings, and observances, preserving procedural memory across generations. Foundation deposits embedded within each rebuilding offer further insight. Small clay figurines, inscribed tablets, and votive objects were placed beneath walls or corners, often replicating deposits from earlier phases. These inclusions suggest that each reconstruction was treated as both a renewal and a continuation. Builders and priests understood that the temple was an ongoing institution, not a single act of creation. Archaeological sequences also indicate practical reasons for continuity. The marshy terrain of southern Mesopotamia requires stable foundations, and adherence to previous plans may have ensured structural reliability. Yet the uniformity exceeds mere engineering. It implies respect for the sacred and administrative order codified over centuries, where alteration could disrupt inherited ritual and social frameworks. Even later expansions at Nippur and Ur echo this principle. Temples are extended incrementally rather than reimagined entirely. New chambers are added, walls reinforced, but the central axis, the locus of sacred presence, remains. The act of rebuilding becomes a way to reaffirm authority, maintain ritual schedule, and transmit knowledge, rather than to innovate for its own sake. The Anunnaki, invoked in liturgical texts associated with these temples, are depicted as patrons and overseers, ensuring the proper maintenance of divine order. Yet they do not appear as designers in these records. The construction, like law, administration, and astronomy, is carried out within a framework already understood, with continuity serving as a bridge between generations rather than as a canvas for novelty. In this light, temple architecture can be read as a form of memory. Each layer preserves not only the physical dimensions but also the procedural knowledge of prior ceremonies, the authority of past rulers, and the expectations of the community. Clay, brick, and foundation deposits function as records, reinforcing social, religious, and administrative continuity. The consistency of these reconstructions raises questions about innovation in early Sumerian society. If sacred architecture is preserved so meticulously, and if each rebuilding repeats the principles of its predecessor, then the act of design may have been considered less important than fidelity to inherited patterns. Structure and ritual become inseparable, and preservation takes precedence over experimentation. And if temples like law, mathematics, and medicine were maintained as inherited frameworks, then what other elements of Sumerian civilization, perhaps the layout of cities, the organization of storage facilities, or the pathways of labor, may have been similarly preserved, encoded into the very spaces where life unfolded, long before their plans were ever inscribed on tablets? If sacred spaces could preserve knowledge across generations, then perhaps narratives, too, were shaped less by invention than by inherited memory. Early Sumerian texts contain origin accounts that describe the emergence of cities, kings, and social order in ways that are both detailed and consistent. These narratives, though local in language and context, show curious parallels with creation and rulership stories in regions far beyond Mesopotamia, suggesting that the structure of memory may be as persistent as the tablets themselves. When comparing Sumerian records with early Egyptian, Indus Valley, and Anatolian traditions, a pattern emerges. In each, the establishment of order follows a recognizable sequence: a primordial landscape or flood, the arrival of structured leadership, and the codification of law, ritual, and administration. The Sumerian king list, for instance, chronicles rulers of enormous longevity in pre-flood times, transitioning to more mortal reigns afterward. Similar sequences appear in Egyptian accounts of divine kingship and in the flood myths preserved in later Mesopotamian variants. The motifs are not identical in detail, yet the structural rhythm, the movement from chaos to codified order, resonates across cultures. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that these parallels cannot be explained solely through direct contact. The chronological and geographic gaps between sites indicate that information did not necessarily flow along trade or conquest routes. Instead, the similarities may reflect a shared cognitive framework, a way of conceptualizing beginnings, authority, and the establishment of society that is encoded in the memory practices of complex communities. Scribes in Uruk recorded their traditions using familiar sequences, and elsewhere in distant lands, comparable narrative structures appear independently, fulfilling similar societal needs. Even the treatment of divine figures shows commonality. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki act as regulators, judges, and overseers of order rather than as originators of human civilization. Egyptian deities, in early inscriptions, similarly function as custodians of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, rather than as solitary creators. These roles reinforce social hierarchy and codified practice, embedding divine sanction into human administration. It is a system that values continuity and regulation over innovation, a pattern that may recur wherever early states seek to consolidate memory and authority. The symbolic language of Sumerian myths further demonstrates this principle. Recurrent motifs, floods, divine assembly, the bestowal of kingship, and cycles of construction and destruction mirror patterns found in distant traditions without suggesting direct transmission. The repetition of structural motifs implies that certain cognitive templates may have guided early record-keeping, shaping what was preserved and how events were ordered for the sake of societal memory. In this light, myths function less as imaginative fiction than as frameworks for encoding inherited knowledge. Even material culture provides subtle reinforcement. Cylinder seals, ritual objects, and administrative devices, though stylistically distinct, often carry iconography that encodes hierarchical order, ritual sequence, and procedural regularity. Across different regions, these objects perform similar functions. They store, transmit, and authenticate memory. Whether through a seal impression in Mesopotamia or a painted icon in the Indus Valley, the principle is the same. Encoded structures stabilize society and ensure the continuity of knowledge. The parallels extend to cosmology as well. Early Sumerian celestial records divide the heavens in ways that correlate with administrative and ritual cycles, creating a temporal structure that mirrors terrestrial order. Comparable patterns emerge elsewhere, with early cultures linking stars and seasonal cycles to governance and ritual. Though the methods of observation differ, the conceptual purpose, using celestial patterns to maintain social and agricultural order, remains consistent. Knowledge is preserved and replicated rather than discovered anew. Yet these echoes raise questions rather than provide answers. If Sumerian and distant traditions share structural patterns without direct contact, then what is the mechanism by which such frameworks emerge independently? Are these similarities the product of convergent memory systems, responding to comparable social and environmental pressures? Or do they hint at a deeper inheritance of procedural knowledge, encoded in ways now only partially recoverable through texts and artifacts? The records suggest that human societies, faced with the challenges of organization, survival, and transmission of authority, developed repeatable cognitive templates. These templates manifest in myth, law, ritual, and administration, allowing complex social structures to persist across time and geography. The repetition of pattern becomes a form of memory, stabilizing order even as generations pass. And if shared structural patterns appear globally without clear evidence of contact, then might the Sumerian records themselves be a window not only into local history, but into a broader human practice of memory preservation, one that predates the artifacts and civilizations we can now observe. The pattern that emerges from successive chapters, from the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets to the careful reconstruction of temples and the codification of law, suggests a common orientation. Civilization is treated as something to be preserved rather than invented. Sumerian records in their administrative, liturgical, and mythological forms repeatedly depict structures, practices, and knowledge as handed down, recovered, or restored. The earliest scribes, whether accounting for grain, recording celestial cycles, or noting the sequence of kings, operate within inherited frameworks, as though the acts themselves are repetitions of a pre-existing order. This principle is evident in the language of the records. Terms describing kingship, temple authority, or civic administration often carry connotations of restoration and maintenance. The king list, for instance, does not begin with creation but with rulers emerging into a world already structured, their reigns measured against the continuity of a previous, pre-flood order. Even when natural disasters or floods intervene, the accounts emphasize the resumption of governance and ritual rather than the founding of new systems. Authority and practice are reconstructed, not improvised, suggesting that scribes and leaders understood their civilization as a restoration of an inherited pattern. Archaeological evidence reinforces this notion. In cities such as Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, Each building layer, each reconstruction, is a careful continuation of what preceded it. Temples are rebuilt on prior foundations, courtyards and altars restored to their previous orientation. Administrative buildings follow inherited layouts, with storage rooms, offices, and workspaces retaining the same proportions across generations. Even when technological refinements occur, the underlying structures and purposes remain consistent. This continuity is a physical manifestation of the same principle observed in textual records. Civilization is a matter of recovery, preservation, and adherence to precedent. The mathematical and astronomical texts further illustrate this orientation. The sexagesimal system, applied to land division, accounting, and timekeeping, appears in its functional form from the earliest extant records, fully capable of administration without evidence of experimental or developmental stages. Celestial observations are cataloged with precision, yet the language and method imply knowledge transmitted through generations rather than derived empirically in the moment. The Sumerians, in recording these patterns, treat the cosmos and its cycles as inherited structures that must be preserved, understood, and applied to maintain order on Earth. Medicine and law, too, are recorded in this same frame. Diagnostic protocols, treatment formulas, and legal codes emerge fully formed in the surviving tablets. There is little evidence of trial and error or provisional rules. Instead, procedures are written as if they had been established long before the current scribes set them down. The repetition of precise formulae, standardized notations, and consistent terminology conveys that these practices are part of a longer lineage, preserved and restored, rather than the product of immediate innovation. Even myth and liturgy support this perspective. References to the Anunnaki depict these figures as administrators of pre-existing systems, enforcing, judging, or regulating rather than originating human institutions. Flood myths, creation narratives, and temple rituals frame the world as one whose order has been disrupted and must be re-established. The texts themselves suggest that the role of humans, kings, and priests is to recover, continue, and preserve what already exists, operating within a framework whose ultimate origins are acknowledged as beyond the immediate historical record. The implications of this approach extend beyond individual domains. Sumerian civilization, in this light, is not a series of firsts but a continuum of recovery. The city, the temple, the law, the accounting tablet, and the king's rule are all treated as inheriting authority from prior structures, physical, legal, and ritual. Even when catastrophic events occur, from floods to social collapse, the record emphasizes restoration rather than invention, suggesting that civilization is valued for its endurance and the fidelity with which it is maintained. This treatment of knowledge as inheritance challenges conventional narratives of human progress that emphasize discovery and creation. In Sumerian texts, the priority is to transmit, to reconstruct, and to sustain. Whether through the rebuilding of temples atop older foundations, the meticulous accounting of grain and labor, or the structured registration of celestial and temporal cycles, each act is a continuation of precedent. The scribes, kings, and builders appear less as inventors than as stewards, preserving an order that is treated as older than themselves. Yet these patterns also raise a quiet, persistent question. If every aspect of civilization is framed as recovery and preservation, what then is the origin of the knowledge and structures they inherit? The texts, the tablets, and the archaeological record provide abundant evidence of restoration and continuity, but the ultimate beginning, the first act that established these frameworks, is left unrecorded. It is as if Sumerian civilization, while meticulously chronicled in its transmission and maintenance, deliberately circumscribes the moment of inception, focusing attention on stewardship rather than genesis. And so, as we trace the inherited patterns of administration, law, temple architecture, and ritual practice, The question that naturally follows is, where does this chain of recovery itself begin? And what traces, if any, remain of the very first act that set the order of Sumerian civilization into motion? If you found this journey through authentic Sumerian history valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more evidence-based explorations of ancient civilizations. Comment below telling me which aspect of Sumerian achievement you find most impressive: the invention of writing, the development of cities, the technological innovations, or the sophisticated religious and philosophical thinking preserved in their texts. Where are you watching from tonight? What questions do you still have about Sumerian civilization? I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives. Until next time, may your explorations of the past be guided by evidence, inspired by genuine wonder at human achievement, and enriched by appreciation for what our ancestors actually accomplished through their own remarkable capabilities. Thank you for joining me on this journey back before the Anunnaki narrative, back to the authentic origins of human civilization. This has been the complete story of how Sumerian records reveal the first civilization, built by humans, for humans, through human brilliance. Good night, and keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering the real wonders of our ancient past.